Well, welcome back, everyone, to another episode of ResearchWorks podcast. And today, very exciting, we do have on hosting duties today the fabulous Dr. Corinne Walmsley, who's been on the show before. She's an occupational therapist and a researcher. But welcome, Corinne. Nice to have you on the mic again.
Thank you. Thank you for having me back. It's great to be back in the studio again.
I know, and the studio's a pretty cool studio now.
It has. It's changed a little bit. It's evolved over time. It's great to be here.
Thank you for joining us today. I thought you'd be really interested in the work and the researcher that we're going to be speaking to today. This is very, very interesting. And when I read this paper, it was with great intrigue. So today we have the lovely Caitlin Gray from the Telethon Kids Institute joining us today. Welcome, Caitlin.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
It's so nice to have you here. The paper that we'll be discussing was published very recently in Journal of Intellectual and Developmental Disability. And the paper is titled Down Syndrome or Rett Syndrome in the Family, Parental Reflections on Sibling Experience. How good is that, hey?
Yeah, amazing.
It's going to be great.
Really, really good topic. Look, we're really looking forward to getting into the grit of the paper. And for our listeners, I'm going to tell them a little bit more about you. So Caitlin Gray works in the Child Disability team at the Sibling Project, which is supported by an NHMRC funding. She was awarded a PhD scholarship in Paediatrics and is enrolled jointly at Telethon Kids Institute and the University of Western Australia. Caitlin is exploring the relationships and health outcomes of siblings with developmental disability at both an individual, family and population levels.
Wow.
So welcome, Caitlin.
So good. so very good. I love that.
So that was kind of the formal getting to know you part, Caitlin. But we do love the informal part here as well. So I do have a question for everyone today.
Yes.
So it is, if you could magically become a different species for the day, what would you be and why?
Guess
Wow.
first.
Okay.
Welcome to the podcast.
Just to put me on the spot. Wow. Okay. So, yeah, I guess, and this is probably something that's happening at the moment in my back garden, and that is a tadpole, or recently, I don't know if evolved is the right word, to a froglet. So I'd probably be one of those, I guess.
Yes.
They look like they have an
Fun.
exciting time. We have had one in particular that hasn't had, sort of the easiest start to life and sort of had a bit of a wonky tail. And so we needed to sort of pop that one across to a different pond and give it a bit of extra care and put it in a different environment. And it's actually really interesting because this particular tadpole has been the first to evolve, or I think there's a better word, like metamorphosize or something like that. Has been the first to do that out of all the tadpoles. And it was just really interesting to see how, sort of being in an environment that suited it it's flourished. And I think there's some, sort of parallels there with children as well. And, if they're in that environment that supports them and is right for them, then they can flourish.
Speaking like a true psychologist there. I love that, how that comes through. That's really brilliant. That's such an interesting one, because in my backyard, I do hear, you do hear the frogs in your backyard. And I don't know why I do it. I'm quite scared, though. I don't really want to touch them. But I hunt them down and I have a look. And I don't know what possesses me to put my hand into, retic holes. I'm like,
unknown.
Is it there? And I don't know why I do that. And then I accidentally touch them and squirm me. And then I scream and I run away. I don't know why I do it. But
curiosity, isn't it?
Exactly. Exactly. That's a good one. And you could be like a frog and think about their life. Yeah. Look, my animal is a completely different animal. I follow a lot of animals on Instagram because it's just the endorphins. It's lovely to see animals doing great things, and I love watching pandas. I'm obsessed with watching pandas online because they look so cute and they climb into spaces, and I don't know why they would do that. I would love to get into their brain and go, what possesses them to do what they do? Because it looks like the best life. And I reckon Kung Fu Panda caught it perfectly. They bounce about, they roll, they slide, they fall, and
they sleep a lot as well.
They sleep a lot. Yeah, I'd love to get into
that would be nice.
Wouldn't it be nice? I saw the recent one on Instagram. She was just sitting on a chair and just swinging its legs, just looking into the sunset. I'm like, What are you thinking about? I'd love to know.
Living the life.
Living the
life. I love that.
Chewing on some bamboo.
Yeah.
Like, that looks great. What about you, Corin?
Oh, look, I'm going to say dolphin. I love the ocean.
Yes.
They just spend all their time in the ocean, swimming along, frolicking along. Their communication is like, it'd be so intriguing, and they're so curious creatures.
Yeah.
That I think that would be, if I could be a dolphin for a day, I would love that.
And I think they would play tricks on people. Like, I
100%.
think they would have
They
jokes.
are so smart.
They are so smart, yeah.
Yep.
You would go up to someone pretending that you're a shark and see their reaction
Yeah.
and kind of laugh at them. I nearly did my impersonation of a dolphin sound there, but that would have been very pathetic.
Oh, yes.
I'm glad I stopped myself. That's a good animal. Good ones, guys. All right, well, now that everyone knows about our animals, I hope that our listeners are thinking about what animal you could magically import yourself into for the day. But today, let's get into our topic, which has got nothing to do with animals. All right, so this study explores the unique family experiences from the perspective of parents with children diagnosed with Down syndrome, of which there are 156 families, or Rett syndrome, 149 families. So through questionnaires, this study investigates the perceived advantages and disadvantages siblings face, as well as the impacts on holidays and recreational activities alongside the parents' perceived availability of time. The results revealed that parents consistently noted positive personality traits, an optimistic outlook, enhanced skills and rich relationships as advantages for siblings in both groups. However, parents of children with Rett syndrome reported lower availability of time and more difficulties in social engagement and family holidays for siblings. This study concludes that parents' perceptions vary with the type of disability and reflect the capabilities of the child with a disability. It also suggests that sibling experiences can be better understood by directly gathering data from siblings themselves to explore ways to enhance their experiences. Can't wait to get into this.
So excited. All right, well, for our listeners, let's start with the background. Let's really delve into that. So you were talking about intellectual disability among children. What do we currently know about the impact of intellectual disability on children?
So we know the prevalence is around 2%. There are I guess they're categorized into different severity levels, most of those being a mild severity. But obviously those needs vary across children and different types of, sort of assistance, communication, and needing sort of supports around those different areas.
Sure.
Yeah. So, and then they're likely to experience co-occurring impairments?
Comorbidities. And I guess with this study, looking at intellectual disability, we were able to utilise sort of existing databases. We're looking at Down syndrome and Rett syndrome. So being able to explore intellectual disability through the different types of conditions as well, and seeing, look, are there differences between Rett syndrome and Down syndrome in terms of those experiences, and looking at, what those are.
How interesting. Can I just ask a question on the intellectual disability side in terms of how that's assessed and how we know someone has an intellectual disability? Like this prevalence, and mostly mild, how is that determined?
So, I mean, I'm not an expert in intellectual disability and how that diagnosis process works, but from what I know, there are, sort of obviously assessments and testing that are done. And if there are certain levels, so say, under a certain number, produces a number, and if you're between 0 and that number, you might be diagnosed with a lower level of intellectual disability, and then above that, you fall into a different category and a mild to moderate level. And then above that, you're entering into sort of a severe level of intellectual disability.
Sure. So, and is it through, I mean, I know this isn't your area of expertise when it comes to the assessment of it, but is it IQ? I mean, is it something that we're all very familiar with is IQ, or there'll be a whole other battery of assessments that we need to think about?
I think
it's a combination of things.
Combination of testing.
Okay.
So, Caitlin, can you tell us a little bit about Down syndrome and Rett syndrome as well, and some of the features of these?
So for Down syndrome, we know that's an additional chromosome in the genetic material, so that's for the chromosome 21. Prevalence for this one is around 1 in 1,000 live births.
Wow, okay.
And with the Rett syndrome, mutation is in the MECP2 gene
Yes.
of the X chromosome. This one is a lot rarer, looking at 1 in 8,905 females. And we say females because the majority of cases that we see are females. So there's a bit of a difference there between the two disability types.
What I really liked from your paper was how it described some of the positive attributes of children with Down syndrome and Rett syndrome. Can you talk us through, because that's quite rare?
It is rare.
And to talk about it that way,
And to look, sort of when you're researching and looking back through papers and getting that sort of background, it is hard to find that stuff. And I think
so true.
Over time, that picture is changing, and it's something we definitely need to keep in mind, and those positive things need to be reflected in papers and those experiences. And for Down syndrome, things such as that expression of love, attention and joy, determination, forgiveness of others.
So beautiful.
It's really important to include that in our conversation and in our
definitely.
And for Rett syndrome, sort of one of the big things was the nonverbal communication. So for siblings, sort of showing that love in another way. It might be the eye gaze, or it might be sort of a smile or hand movements, just to show that that interaction and that love. That traditional ways of verbalizing that may not be.
That's so beautiful
available
to talk about that, because you're so right. Like everything we read from a medical model perspective is, what do you not have? What are the deficits? You'll describe low tone, you'll describe poor coordination. Like everything is so negative. When you think about how we operate as humans, if you kept telling me about all the things I couldn't do and didn't have, I'd be pretty sad. And that perspective would influence how I see myself, and that's really not fair.
No, it's not.
And it just shows the value of really that strengths-based approach, which I think is coming through in all areas of research now. You're right. There's been a bit of a shift to kind of go, well, let's work from strengths.
Yes.
Because you can't change the fact that someone might have Down syndrome or the fact that someone has Rett syndrome. You can't change that. So talking about the negatives don't always really help, do they? But where can we go from here? So this makes your paper really interesting, because you're specifically interested in researching siblings of children with Down syndrome and Rett syndrome. So talk us through that process. Like, why were you interested in doing this in particular?
So I guess to start off with, sort of a broad personal interest, and that is that I have a son with a disability and a daughter. So sort of, watching her as a sibling of a child with a disability grow up and sort of noticing and recognizing that there are differences in her, experiences to others. And I guess that's that personal interest, but then also, having the opportunity to be involved in research in that area and to explore that, and to, hopefully at some point come to the position where we're helping families more. It is sort of an area that's starting to develop, which is really positive. And there are organisations across Australia that are starting to recognise that, these siblings have gone quite a long time without supports. They haven't been recognised as for, their sort of the different experiences that they do go through. So, it's definitely an area that's growing and something that we hope to provide some strategies and stuff for in the future.
And such an important area as well.
It is. And as you say that, I was just re-looking at your paper, and there's this one paragraph towards the end of your introduction where you said the importance of understanding the experience of siblings of children with intellectual disability is high, because as young children, they often need to navigate challenging environments. They are the family members who live the longest alongside them, and in many cases take on caring roles as adults. It's a pretty significant perspective on their experience. And I think for anyone working in the area, we always see the sibling there. And then you see the parent often feeling quite conflicted because it's school holidays, but we're here. Like, how do I make this experience great for them too? And then there's the guilt that comes from it. So, Yeah, this is why it's so interesting. Oh, and before I get into that, I know we're going to talk more about that broader. So what are some of the key objectives you aim to achieve through this study? Like, what was the main sort of objective, I suppose?
I guess through this study, it was really quite unique in that we had some existing data that was older. And what we kind of hoped, I guess, to achieve was with some of those advantages and disadvantages that have been reported in the past, particularly the advantages, was looking at those amongst the same families, sort of 10 years down the track and seeing if those advantages and all those sorts of things, like the positive personality and the outlook and everything like that, was that still the same, or what, were there anything different, any changes? And what we found was that was a persistent trait over time. So it just shows us that no matter where we are at the moment, and for siblings and for families that have siblings in that position at the moment, and maybe thinking and feeling like you were saying, or this is hard and I feel that guilt, but it was looking at, there is that persistence there of really positive outlooks and advantages for siblings. So that was really great to see. And the other thing again was looking at those disability types and being able to draw out a bit of more information about what is different in some families compared to others. And it's not something that's done very often. It's usually sort of one condition is picked and that's discussed and explored, which is great. But we're kind of left with,
what about us? Where about this group?
And also to know, what is it about Down syndrome, families and Rett syndrome families that are different, and why, what is it that we're seeing that between those two that we can, support siblings better, and it needs to be something that is individualized to.
What a beautiful objective. Such
siblings.
A human objective. I really love that, and which is why we love this paper. I'm just really keen to talk about it more.
Look, Caitlin, you mentioned an incredible database that you're able to kind of draw some of this information from. So in terms of like the methodology for this study, can you tell us a little bit more about that for the listeners?
Yeah, so like I said, we used existing data from two databases, and that was the Rett syndrome database and the Down syndrome database. And we, fortunately, at the time, questions were asked to families, sort of going back even as early as, I think it was the first one came through at 1997, that asked questions about siblings, which for that point in time is really, really
progressive at that point.
Right. To have that. And so, sort of the paper utilised data that was later to sort of look at, are these still those experiences? And the great thing about the databases is that families have already provided a lot of the data on quite a large scale, which is often hard. Recruitment can be really quite tricky on that scale.
These are great numbers. That just shows how engaged this community is, though, in research too.
It's so incredible that it's so longitudinal. Like since, did you say 1997?
1997, the first one.
And then this one was 2009, I believe, when I saw from the paper, wasn't it? So that's a decent amount of time. That's a good transition, I guess, from, childhood to adulthood. Is that sort of the age group that we were looking at here?
Kind of capturing the longevity of it over time.
Yeah, that's right.
So can you tell us a bit about why we chose a questionnaire approach for this study, Caitlin?
So this one was already, sort of the questionnaires have been done over sort of waves, I guess, of data collection. And I guess in doing that, we do need to recognise that some of the language and some of the ways of doing things have changed over time as well. And some of the ways that questions can be worded and that sort of thing do change. And, it's when you are using data that has been collected, there is that potential to...
You just have to use it, don't you? It's been done.
use what you've got there. And sometimes, and I guess in the paper as well, it said that some of the questions could be framed in a slightly, you know,
for sure, yeah,
certain way, which may sway some of those responses. But at the time, you know, it's given us some really good data that we otherwise wouldn't have, and you know, sort of being able to then further explore that at a later point, and
it's such an interesting perspective when you say that. Like in 10 years, we all evolve as people and as researchers. I mean, I know I've looked at questionnaires that I would have written 10 years ago now, and I go, oh my goodness, that could be so much better now. And that is the beauty of research, isn't it? Where you can reflect on that and you can reflect on the times. And this is why it's so important to keep doing research because perspectives do change, and then that's also the beauty of this, that there is that evolution of time that we're still trying to capture, and then you know the themes are the same. So we're about to go into the results now. So just to recap there, from who was included, so it was 156 parents of children with Down syndrome and 149 with Rett. So when you analysed all of these results that are coming from these families, what sort of approach did you use? What was the methodology, I guess, and how you did that?
So we took all of the responses for the various questions and entered them into sort of software, and then trawled through and sorted and pulled out the relevant themes and quotes and sort of used those to support what we were finding in the data. And
so great qualitative sort of thematic analysis was the process, and that's always a beautiful process to go through.
It is.
Well, let's get into the results now. So we know what's been included, we know the methodology. Let's go into what we found. It's the meaty part.
So I guess what was some of the advantages that parents reported for siblings of children with Down syndrome and Rett syndrome?
So the biggest one that came out was the personality traits, positive personality traits. And that came across for both groups and sustained over, you know, sort of a 10-year period from when the last similar questions were asked. So that, and I think the age groups were the age groups for this one were slightly older for the Down syndrome group as well. So it was able to capture quite a broad range of ages of children, ages of siblings as well.
So the positive personality traits was kind of what we spoke about before. It was the forgiveness, the ability to show like caring and compassion.
Yes.
So that was really confirmed through this.
Really.
Yeah. Fantastic.
And having that positive outlook on life and that real ability to see other people and to be able to empathise with others and just those really positive
it's great to confirm that in this data set and in this, you know, I don't know where that data originally came from of how we describe children, but it's always good to know what that is in different settings. Now with some of the disadvantages, because it also picked up on some disadvantages as well, didn't it?
Just one more on the advantages as well. It was just in terms of, I think it was covered under learning. And that was a really fascinating thing that came out because it looked at the indirect learning, but then it also looked at the direct learning. So what it was finding, and this is quite relevant as well to therapy, but it was finding that those siblings had actually participated in therapy over time and that they were actually, you know, sort of benefiting from some of the therapy that their sibling was participating in. So things like social communication and those sorts of things were really seen to be quite high in siblings because from an early age they had been participating in quite specific therapies and that was seen as a really positive outcome for siblings. So there is that potential for inclusion and you know they're part of the family. They're often, you know, in some cases come along to therapies and have to be there. So there is this huge potential for them to be involved and supported in that way. So
Well, that's really great, isn't it?
How great that they're able to take that away from being in the therapeutic setting and take that out into the home environment and use that as well, which is really, really nice.
Yeah, for sure.
When you think about how you want to embed those, the reason why you go to therapy is to have new ideas, what you can do, and you can embed them within a holistic setting, and it's not always on the parents necessarily. It's their siblings where there's a lot of play involved. So that's a really beautiful positive. All right, well, let's go through some of those disadvantages then that was recognised by parents for siblings. What were they?
I think the big one was time. And this is where we probably did see quite a big difference between families of children with Rett syndrome and families of children with Down syndrome. And with families with Rett syndrome being sort of more disadvantaged by time availability. And this was stuff like, for example, parents not having enough time for themselves and other things that they wanted to sort of pursue, but also for the siblings' time. So not having that parental time and attention that, sort of with the parent spending a lot of their time focusing on the child with the disability. That often, some of the quotes were that they didn't have enough time at the end of the day or felt exhausted or were so tired and started to feel quite, impatient and, sort of not having that time, and even things sort of with helping the sibling with homework and those sorts of things that they missed out on, I guess.
And didn't have enough time for that in their day.
And definitely the guilt of that came through.
For sure. I mean, there's only so many hours in a day, isn't it? That's one of those things. Time, unfortunately, is that rare commodity, and you can only do so much. And the reasons behind, what do you think about the reasons behind the difference between Down syndrome and Rett syndrome?
It is a difficult one. Some of the differences we noted that came out in some of the quotes and comments, and this was across all of the questions, was to do with mobility or other medical issues they were having to attend to for the child, sort of peg feeding or, sort of things with other mobility issues or seizures. Lots of contact with hospitals and having to plan and that sort of thing. So there is that side of things. The other side of things was that the family sizes in Down syndrome were larger, and there was sort of the idea that perhaps there's more supports because of the size of the family, sort of shared responsibility.
The advantages from a sibling's perspective.
So there is that as well. And also that the Down syndrome families were older now. So, sort of they've had a few years to reflect on their circumstances and perhaps their child has grown up, more over time, and they're not reflecting on the here and now. They've sort of had a few years between, being right in a difficult time. And so, talking about and answering these questions wasn't as, there are lots of things we could think about as to what the differences are, but those were some of the things that could explain that difference in
really
families.
And we do know that children with Rett syndrome do have more comorbidities, right? So seizures is something that can take any family off their feet because it's so unpredictable and uncontrollable. And then PEG and, looking after that and the number of appointments they might have as well. It does make a whole lot of sense. Was there anything else that were noted as disadvantages for siblings that you picked up?
There was the missed opportunities, which I guess reflects a little bit further into recreation and holidays, which we'll talk about. The impacts on the relationships was probably another big one, and that was relating to sort of the peer relationships for siblings. There were some quotes that mentioned that they didn't have friends over to the house, or they didn't get the time to go out and spend with their peers. And, that's a huge thing for any age to just not have the availability or being able to go out and make those connections and have that social support. So that was another big one.
So time and relationships was a big factor. you mentioned the impacts on kind of social and recreational activities. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
So just before I jump onto the recreation side of things, with the disadvantages, I think it's important to note as well, and I think I was mentioning this before, but in terms of the outlook, when we report disadvantages and when parents talk about disadvantages, and this relates to a paper that, sort of an older paper I came across recently, and it was after this paper had been written. But the title of it was something like, "I'm not sad, I'm tired." And it was the parents sort of saying that, it's not necessarily that emotional kind of context that these disadvantages are coming through. It's actually because they felt that their child wasn't supported in that environment. And so we're sort of seeing, and it was, really quite an eye-opener to say that it's not because of the child that I'm feeling this way or that there are these disadvantages for our family. It's because the social supports or the environment is not quite there yet in terms of being able to provide that.
And I guess that makes
extra
sense,
support.
because then when they sense that, who's left to advocate for their child? It's their parent. And once that goes in, it's more time and impact carryover into siblings as well. So that makes a whole lot of sense, and it just reflects so much on what we can do as a society and community and environment and to better understand, doesn't it? Yeah. That's a beautiful reflection and a wonderful paper to talk about, really, like in terms of having them together. It makes a whole lot of sense.
Yeah, it does. The environment is very predictive of that kind of thing. So it's very important that we consider the environment perspective.
But moving on to recreation. This was a really fascinating one and something that there's not much on that's been done in the research. It's an area that I guess in some ways is taken for granted. You only have to drive around Perth on the weekends and see all of the ovals full of children running around playing different sports or, after school activities or, anything that could be sport, it could be music, it could be whatever
True.
the kids are interested in. But it's a huge gap. And I guess for what we found was that siblings of children with intellectual disabilities are not experiencing recreation in the same way as others. And at a surface level, that's, sort of sport or activities. But when you look deeper and you consider, look, when your child goes to these things, it's not just about the activity. There's the opportunity for that social connection.
That's right.
There's the opportunity to learn new skills. There's the opportunity for the parents to socialise. There's a lot going on there that we don't really consider. And for families that don't have that opportunity, I think that's a big gap, and that's something that we could, sort of look to providing supports and find out why are these siblings not able to have these opportunities and what can be done for them.
It's good to put the spotlight on this group of children, I think is what I'm really taking from this. Is we can see them, they're always there, but that's the problem. They're always there. It's seen and coming to therapy and doing all those things where are taking them away from really valuable experiences, like you're talking about with recreation. You mentioned a little bit earlier about holidays. You said you'd come back to that. Can you talk to us about holidays? Because holidays is a favourite topic for many people to talk about.
I think for holidays is a huge one. And many families go on holidays. And that's sort of expected, I guess, for most families that every year or every school holidays, and when we're talking about holidays, it may even be, referring to a couple of days away. It's not necessarily a huge family holiday or something overseas or anything like that. It's being able to have that break away from your daily environment. And for these families, what we were seeing was that this isn't occurring in the same way that it is in other families. And they're often, number one, not going on holidays at all, or the experience of planning for a holiday when you have a child with a disability is, adds another level of complexity when you're providing care and a new environment, an environment where you may have to take equipment or supplies or, you know, find out a bit more about the environment. And for families with Down syndrome, this related to providing supervision for the child. There were quotes that covered sort of wandering and being able to lock doors and have, you know, sort of create a safe environment for the child away from home, which you often can't, you know, sort of do when it's not your home, and providing that kind of supervision away from where you would regularly do that. So there are lots of different complexities. And for families of children with Rett syndrome, that was a lot of equipment moving or being able to participate and access. And that comes back to community as well, and environment, and being able to access the environment in that way. And some of that has improved over time. So when you think back to when these questions were asked, yes, we have improvements, and those sorts of things can be seen, you know, down the beach. You might be able to hire a wheelchair now.
Yeah, that's right.
Or there's access matting, so you can get down to the beach. But I think we still have a long way to go with that, because some of that stuff needs to be booked.
That's right.
And you can't just say,
just go.
Let's just go to the beach today.
Planning.
You need to book. That's a different experience.
It is.
It's not a spontaneous thing.
I think you're so true. Spontaneity is a big word.
So it's different. And we need to recognise that. And I think we have quite a way to go in being able to, you know, sort of allow for those families to enjoy that spontaneity. And,
I think as you describe that, I can't help but to think about, I mean, I love a good framework. And there's the family of participation related constructs, which is all about participation, as the name suggests. And what we're constantly hearing is this big envelope that comes around it, which is environment. And then context comes within that. Then you've got the person and all the different connections and their preferences and family. But the environment is so huge. And I was just reflecting on some of the families we've been talking to who, there's one particular family I'm thinking of that they have never really been able to go on a holiday before. And the moment their child was able to do a transfer more independently meant that they could go on a plane. And so they've booked a trip to go on a plane. And so they're going to go off. But it's incredible how even get onto a plane, you've got to forward plan so much, let alone once you get there, what kind of hire car I'm going to get, and will all my equipment arrive, let alone the safety and the environment, and is the bathroom actually accessible, like what is it going to look like for it to truly mean a holiday. And I love that your paper puts a spotlight on that and talking about holidays. It's really beautiful, isn't it?
Very unique.
Really, really great.
So I guess this really leads into the next question quite beautifully. I want to ask about families and healthcare and policymakers. Like, what are some of the key implications that, based on your findings, that we can take away for that?
I think, like we've touched on before, that siblings are there. They're part of the picture. They need to be included. And if that, you know, needs to be in policies, and, you know, recognising that siblings do provide support in the home, and, you know, we need to include them in those policies that look at supports for siblings. We provide, you know, there are policies that provide supports for the child with a disability. And, you know, they need to take into account the family environment and the siblings living in that environment, and what we can do to support them. And what supports they need, I guess, at different ages. So younger siblings are going to need different supports to older siblings. So finding out more about what they are specifically, and including them in frameworks, like you said, and policies, and
it's making sure they're not just the backseat ride to all of this. They're actually included. When we talk about families, I think you're really right. We often talk about families, you think of parents straight away, because they often do carry such a big part of it, don't they? That the siblings are also there to hold that. And the family unit is only stable if the family unit is stable, and that's everyone everyone in there. So I can see how every person involved, whether it's a school, whether it's therapy providers, whether it's community holiday, vacation holiday, what is it called? School holiday programs? Vacation care, that one. Yeah. How they do need to think broadly about this and including it as part of their policies is, a great way to start putting that into the picture. Yeah. There's so many things to it, I guess, and I guess from a lived experience as well, you're also seeing the value of all of this too.
Definitely, for sure.
Yeah. Well, I guess my final question is always about what this all means, and we kind of have really touched on this a fair bit, but let's talk about what sort of advice you would give for parents who are striving to balance the needs of their child with a disability and their sibling.
Yeah.
What would your thoughts be on that?
So I'm going to go a few steps back and say that this paper looked at the parent perspective. And that's really important. That gives us a picture, particularly for family holidays and recreation and stuff like that. It gives us that picture that we wouldn't get from asking siblings directly. It gives us that planning and the organisation involved and perhaps the finances and the resources needed and some of that, picture that perhaps younger siblings wouldn't be able to provide us. So having that was essential for this.
Yeah.
What we don't have in this paper particularly is the voice from the siblings.
Sure.
But what we do know from, in the literature is that parent report and sibling report can differ.
Yeah. Sure.
Sibling reports are often more positive than parent reports, which is really interesting. And I think we need to keep that in mind. And, sort of my advice would be that, talk to the siblings. They're often seeing things in a more positive way than the parents. So it's really important. And parents, we talked about the guilt before and all of that sort of stuff.
Yeah.
I think it's, sometimes as parents we can really quite jump to those, sort of worst case scenarios and that sort of thing. And that may not be what the sibling is experiencing at the time. And I think it's important to, ask them, what their needs are, what they're feeling, and keep them in the conversation about why things become unbalanced at times and what can be done to sort of put the balance back a little bit. And sometimes, and that could be different experiences, but what a sibling needs may be something that's achievable in smaller bits than what perhaps parents, with their lens might think. It could just be some little bits that are needed and to start there. And, it's somewhere to start. And I guess including them and involving them is a huge important part of that, because they do pick up on a lot more than perhaps we think at times. And,
that's such great advice.
I think the next steps are, and particularly for our group, is to ask the siblings directly, and that's what we're doing now, is to
brilliant. It's a more balanced perspective as well.
Ask them the questions. What supports do you need? Why aren't you going out to sporting activities? What would you like to do? How does this compare to your peers? Those sorts of questions. So
their perspective. And seeing how that matches up with the parental perspectives as well. Really interesting.
And I love that you said that, because you're so right. Guilt is one of the things that you see from your lens, from where you're sitting. And it might not always be real. That there's always that perspective too, and it all comes from a place of love and wanting the best for everyone, and they might be all right. They might be quite happy and they just love their sibling. And
I think that advantage that came through of having those positive personalities and that positive outlook really does sort of, draw on that and hopefully, by including them and by getting a bit more of their perspective
actually pretty
directly,
resilient.
will help.
Yeah.
It will help with that.
Oh, I love that. Well, we've had a great conversation with you, but it's not done just yet. We love going to our final segment, which is called Tell It to Ed. Ed, as you know, is our producer. He doesn't have a background in child health, but he has been listening on this conversation, pressing buttons, pushing up and down faders. I don't know which word to use for that. But anyway, he's here and he's present. We're glad he is. But for him to ask you a question, we first ask that you provide about a 60-second summary about your research, and Ed will have time for one question. Yeah, go for it, Caitlin.
Okay, so what we found was, parents of children with Down syndrome and Rett syndrome are not, the siblings in these families are not experiencing recreation activities and holidays like others do, and that there are some disadvantages. The positive things that came through were the positive outlook on life of these siblings, their personality traits, their ability to learn and skill development over time and by participating in therapies with their siblings. And we just need to now look at the sibling side of things and confirm what we've learnt from this and to find out what supports are actually needed for these siblings and to ask them and involve them.
Yeah, involving them. That's the true point. That was beautiful. Thank you very much. Ed, over to you.
Thank you. It's been a great conversation today. Quite holistic is probably how I would describe it.
To describe
Good way.
It covered a lot of ground, but from lots of different angles. And it's been great to sit in and listen on that. And I guess my question to all of this is maybe something slightly more personal. Obviously, you mentioned that you are the parent of a child with a disability. So, and I won't ask you private questions, but I guess from a holistic perspective, that seems to be the word of the day. What might have been surprising or impactful for you on a personal level, and how that kind of correlates to, I guess, research and evidence in the field, and what that perspective is like from a researcher's perspective to the family perspective.
Good question. I think going into this was realizing that there's not too much done in this area. And for personal experience as well is experiencing that for my children, sort of going up over time, there wasn't sibling supports. We sort of looked around and there was nothing. And coming through sort of a hospital system and then going into therapy and that sort of thing, it's quite an eye-opener that it is, sort of that individual focus and, that's not, always including that family environment and for siblings. And so it's, that was probably the biggest thing.
Okay.
But it provides an opportunity now to further that research. And I guess this paper is the start of things. And there's a lot of other work going on within the Sibling Project. And there's quite a bit in development at the moment. And as I mentioned, asking siblings directly in a new study called Teen Talk, where we're actually recruiting at the moment for additional sibling advisors and parent advisors because it's important that they're involved from the first steps of any research that we do, and getting them involved and asking them the questions. Hopefully that will get to a point where we do know a bit more about what supports they need and at what stages of development they need them, and that will help us inform strategies and policies and
so great
and that sort of thing. So,
gosh, I love that. I love the drive for that, the need for it.
Definitely.
We'll probably, if you want to share any of that information on the project as you're recruiting, we can pop that on our website
that'd
too.
be great.
Because I think this is so important, and I think this is something that all of our listeners, researchers, therapists, parents are going to relate to. So great question. Thank you for summarising that. And to all of our listeners, we will put all of this information on our website, researchworks.net, as well as that link as well. So, Caitlin, thank you so much for that. And there's a CPD form there that you can fill out as well if you want to keep this as part of a record of your PD requirements. But for now, we must say thank you and goodbye. That was just absolutely amazing. Thank you so much for coming in today and braving the traffic to come in. We do appreciate your time. Yeah, it was just so wonderful.
Yeah.
And hopefully we can talk to you again soon with the next stages of it and follow
That'd be
your
great.
journey. It'll be
Yeah, for
absolutely
sure.
wonderful. So to all of our listeners, I hope you enjoyed that too. We'll talk to you all again really soon. Bye.